Good afternoon and welcome to NRCS's Conservation Outcomes webinar series. My name is Liz Marshall and I serve as the Outcomes Team Leader for NRCS's Outcomes Team. The Outcomes Team conducts this webinar series to highlight NRCS's conservation outcomes assessment efforts and to demonstrate innovative conservation tools and data that can assist with conservation planning and with impact assessment. Many of the projects described in these webinars are administered through the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, or CEAP. CEAP has as its mission to quantify the environmental effects of conservation practices and conservation programs and to develop the science base necessary to effectively manage the agricultural landscape for environmental quality. The webinars take place on the fourth Thursday of each month at 3 p.m. We will get started with the presentation in just a minute, but first a few logistics. The webinar is being recorded. All participants joining today's webinar are in listen-only mode, and all audio is being broadcast through your device's speakers. If you're having any audio challenges, computer or mobile device headsets may help with your audio quality and volume. Also, please note the closed captioning link that is provided in the box on your screen entitled Today's Links. The captions open in a new browser window where you can follow along with our presenters' comments. Although you don't have audio, we still want you to be able to participate in today's webinar. So please type any questions or comments into the Q&A box that you will shortly see on your screen. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation. However, questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Please also note the connection status bar indicator to the right of the Help button in the Adobe Connect menu bar. If your bars all show as green, that generally means that your network connection is strong and you should be able to join in today's webinar. However, if you have a weak connection or if you experience interruptions in bandwidth that prevent you from participating today, the webinar recording will be accessible through the Conservation Outcomes Webinar Series webpage. The link to that site is in the box on your screen labeled Today's Links. A PDF of today's slides is also available to download from the box on your screen entitled Today's Handout. I'm now pleased to turn the microphone over to Kevin Norton, Associate Chief of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, to introduce today's webinar. After Kevin's introductory remarks, we will turn the reins over to Lee Norfleet. Lee is NRCS's Cropland Component Leader for the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, and he will conduct today's webinar. Thank you, and now over to you, Kevin.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to each and every one of you that took the time out of your day to join us for this third webinar in our series. And I think the thing that strikes me is, as you begin to see this information, is just the landscape of America that we practice conservation on, the diversity of the work that's taking place as we've gone through these different webinars, and the partnerships surrounding the actual implementation on private lands. So it's really exciting. This is actually the second of the CEAP cropland efforts. Lee Norfleet has been leading this for a number of years, and just really some things that we had long held to be the proper way to work with a producer and assemble conservation work on the land, going clear back to our founder, Hugh Hammond Bennett. We're beginning to see, as we continue to move through these evaluations, these assessments, and the checking back to the landscape and the work we're doing, we're beginning to validate and see not only the successes, but also the changes that we can make and adjustments as we're working with those private land stewards to leverage their conservation efforts to greater benefits, not only for their operation, but for the watersheds and the communities that they're working in. So that's a pretty exciting report that you're going to see here, some really good information. And thank you again for taking time out of your afternoon to be with us and to participate in this report. Lee, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Like I said, today we're going to go over 10 years of change between the two CEAP surveys. The first one that had ever been conducted was from 2003 to 2006. And in that one, we had to make a kind of a fictitious no practice scenario in which we took all the conservation away just to look at what benefits were on the ground. Now we've got 10 years fast forward, we can look at what happened in that. So we've got 2 time periods to compare what our progress has been. So this is about 10 years of change, and we're just going to talk about structural practices in the conservation tillage today. We'll have a series of reports to cover all that we capture in that CEAP survey that will follow on, and I'll go over that at the end of the presentation. One thing I did realize after 10 years of change is that I'm the only one left that was around for the first CEAP that went around. So the rest of my team are new to this effort, and all the other folks are retired and gone. So it has been a quite big 10 years of change for us. So the way we did the first CEAP, we did it on large major river basins, and so the river basins don't necessarily, they'll cut across production regions and production types and even major climates. The Missouri River being the most classic, that goes from the Canadian border in Montana and almost, and then extends all the way down to southeast Missouri. And so there's a lot of climates there, a lot of different crops, and so that really didn't work well for a lot of analysis and report writing. So we moved these around to production regions, and these regions should have some commonality in either resource concerns, crop production systems. We group things like the Southern Plains, and they're in the middle. They're grouped largely because they're heavy on cotton and wheat, but they also, it's one in which that's where our major wind erosion problems are. So that's kind of a resource concern area. And Northern Plains is where we have the spring wheats and the durum wheats in with the rest of the crops that they're growing up there. So those are kind of the concepts that we have these grouped in. And it seems to be working a little better, and it also allowed us to spread our points out a little bit. These points that we have selected that we do the surveys on are from the NRI, and it's a randomized statistical survey sample set in which these points have a weight that will add up to the cropland acres of the U.S. So because of that, the scale at which we use this data really matters. And so the smallest unit that we will probably report on will be the Huck 4 size. So if you're familiar with the hydrologic units of the U.S. system, you'll know about what those sizes are. So at each of those points, we get data from 4 major sources, and so we're able to capture all the practices that we know to exist on these sites. The primary sample, the primary data source that we have is what makes the CEAP project on cropland quite unique, is that it's a face-to-face interview with the farmer. And that's where NASS enumerators make an appointment with the farmer on the selected point that we have from NRI, and they have an interview that lasts about 70 minutes or so, and I'll go over the survey instrument in a moment. But also at those points, since they are NRI points, we've got a lot of other practices that have been collected since the start of the NRI and its first report back in 1982. So we have a really good sense of history at that point. And then there's a selection of practices that the NRI has tracked over these years that we'll have an idea of how long these have been there and been maintained. The third source that we have is from our field office records. So when that point lands in a field, if that field is connected to any practices participation, program participation, technical assistance, anything we do there that's in our field office records, we capture that as well. So that's the other source. And then the last source that we get, if the Farm Services Agency has any CCRP or CREP practices, and even the CRP practices that we look at sometimes, they're all in there and captured as well. So those are the 4 major places that we get our data from. But again, the key is the NASS Farmer Survey, and it's what we think of as the farmer's voice. It's unfiltered. It's not asking a county agent or a district conservationist, what are your farmers in your area doing or anything like that. It's the farmer telling us exactly what they're doing. So the survey, it's about 44 pages long, takes about 70 minutes on average. There's some, you can imagine some of those that grow, multiple truck crops in a year and have lots of different pesticides applied or anything like that. It's going to run that up pretty big. But most of the time it takes just a little over an hour to do. And what we capture basically is a diary or a 3-year window of all their agronomic practices, production practices. So the dates they planted, how they planted it, all the tillage that's associated with the crops that are grown, their fertilizers and manures, the date they applied it, the amount, the methods, all the 4 R's are captured there. Then there's the pesticides that we capture. Irrigation systems are captured in there and how they use them. Any of the conservation practices that they've adopted. And this is conservation practices not only that they've adopted on their own, because that's what this survey will capture, are things that the landowner is doing on their own, but it also captures those that they've adopted either through state or local programs, NGO programs, and then our federal programs. The other thing that's unique about this is OMB has a requirement to reduce the burden of government on citizens, that we can only ask about 1 field for each operator. We can't add, so if an operator statistically, for some reason, they have multiple fields show up in the sample draw, we can only ask them about 1 of them. And right now, the record, a gentleman in Arkansas had 39 of his fields selected. And I will say he farmed about 25,000 acres, so that increased his odds of being selected, but we could only ask him about 1 field that he had in there. So that's kind of one of the constraints that we have going forward, is as agriculture begins to be consolidated into fewer and fewer operators, our ability to get multiple fields will diminish until we get OMB to let us, maybe ask for 2 fields on a person's land units or something like that. And copies of that survey, if you're interested, can be found at our website, the CEAP cropland site, as well as NAS. And if you just type in NAS CEAP or NRCS CEAP cropland survey, it'll take you right to it. And there's a copy of the survey of each year we've done these. So once we've gathered all that information, the NRI gives us the point, so we know what soil type there is, the slope, and all the other geophysical information about that point. We use a model called APEX, and APEX is the field scale model that we then take that information and route it to the SWOT model, which is a watershed-based model. So those are the way those 2 models work together. But basically what we're doing is we're following where soil and nutrients and pesticides are going that are being transported by wind or water. So anywhere water is going and taking something with it, this process model working on a daily time step. So every day that something happens, the model's running and making a calculation and developing output each day. And so we're tracking that every day throughout the year, and we're using 30 years, the most recent 30 years of weather is what we use. These weather stations are selected at the Huck 12 scale, so each point that where it lands, it's Huck 12 that it lands in, will have a weather station assigned to it. So we've got several thousand weather stations that we are using to supply our weather information to run these models. So to stay with kind of what we have and what our survey is starting to show up, the first thing that we found was that we had about 11 million acre increase from 304 million acres of cultivated cropland to about 315 million acres. Most of that came from non-cultivated cropland, which is often idle land or hay land, and some of it might have been CRP land, but that's what's moved in and supplied about 9 million of the acre. Most supplied the extra 11 million acres was from these idle lands or underused lands. And of those that moved in, we had a 9 million acre increase in highly erodible land. So that is some concern there to think about that. So we wanted to look at how those 9 million acres were of HEL land were treated, and found out about 88% of those acres that moved from HEL into production moved in with some conservation in place. So they didn't just bring them back in and start farming like they did when they maybe entered it into CRP or it idled. They brought it back in and added conservation to it, which is a really good bit of news. So just looking at the CRP land, when it came into production since the last CEAP, the last 10 years, you can see that 62% of the CRP land that converted into other land uses, according to our survey, went to cropland, about 26% went to pasture, and about 12% went to hayland. And on this, you can see that only 12% of the CRP land that went into cropland came in with no practices. Just 88% of it had something, either structural practices by themselves, conservation tillage only, or structural practices with conservation tillage. So that's a good bit of work. That 12% that came back into production, almost all of that was those acres that were highly erodible due to wind erosion. So there's some work that needs to be done there, and there's some pretty legitimate reasons why they may have come back in without a lot of practices being added. So kind of go over what we found. We found really three major trends that happened in this decade between the two CEAP surveys. And one of those, it kind of follows on one of our findings from the first CEAP survey, is that we found a lot of conservation out there. We found a lot of incomplete conservation planning. So we had, maybe one practice was there and then they considered that good and went on. And so we had a lot of adoption, but not a lot of adoption that was as thorough as it needed to be, and completed the treatment and got the most out of the practices that were put out there. We also found that there was an increase in the adoption of multiple structural practices out there. So it wasn't they were just putting in one, they're putting in multiple practices, which was really compounding the benefits of those practices. So that's a really good step, and it really followed what we found was needing to occur, was a more complete package and more complete treatment of the landscape with these multiple practices. And then the third, many of you know that we've been challenged to target our resources and target to the most vulnerable lands. And we saw that continued emphasis, and we saw that it's really paying off, that we really are doing some significant targeting. And there's some pretty impressive slides to show that how we've really gone after these lands that are the worst of the worst as far as needing treatment and how we address those. So starting with that first point, having more thorough treatment, we looked at the practices of being applied on the landscape. How many acres had no structural practice or conservation tillage? That dropped 40%. And so overall, we saw that 81% of all the cropland acres had one or more structural practices or conservation tillage, or both, by the time CEAP 2 came along. So, and as you know, not all acres are going to require structural practices, according to our tech guys, to meet things like T and to stay in compliance with HCL provisions and those type of things. So there's a lot of adoption going on lands that we may not typically, put a lot of emphasis on structural practices that we're actually getting them. You can see also, using that single practice solution, put one thing down and just go on to the next thing, that declined also by 19%. And so we saw huge increases in conservation tillage, but only a 16% increase in just using that as a solution. If you look over at using structural practices and conservation tillage, there was a 79% increase in that. So overall, there were an additional 60 million acres treated with conservation practices that, basically are controlling erosion and runoff. And of that 60 million, 46 million of them were those that applied both structures like terraces, filter strips, buffers, and those type things, and conservation tillage along with it. So that's really getting at, we're doing a lot more planning out there, and our emphasis on conservation planning is really paying off, and now we've got the numbers to show it. Kind of in graphical forms, you can see the changes by our production regions. One thing to note about these slides, depending on what your screen looks like, is that in all these slides that we have the maps and the pictures, we want to make that orange slice of the pies smaller and that darker green slice of these pies bigger. So if you look at this and look back, you can see that definitely occurred, that the orange pieces of the pies got a lot smaller. And that's where you can see that in CEAP 1, 32% of the acres had neither structure or conservation tillage, and then by CEAP 2, 10 years later, that dropped down to 19% of the acres. So this is another thing that you can see these changes. There's a lot of things that kind of explain how these changes were moving, and maybe why some areas didn't move as much. One thing to note is areas that rely on a significant amount of irrigation, especially gravity-fed irrigation, but any irrigation at all, even drip trickle, you're going to have a lot of land forming. You got a lot of land disturbance in those. They also tend to grow a lot of the truck crops in there, and their industry standards kind of require some conservation tillage in there. And then you've got the cotton and rice production areas that tend to be heavily tilled, along with peanuts and potatoes. So anywhere you find a significant acreage of those unique plants, root crops and rice and those type things, you're going to find that that orange slice may not have changed quite as much, but we got a decrease in most of these areas. That's a really big deal there. The one thing that you can see from this and start thinking about is, okay, we see these changes. We went from 32% to 19% in these 10 years. What are we going to do in the next 10 years? What should the next picture, and we put a new graphic up there, and the pie chart shows up again. What should that percentage be? Should we expect 100%? Some things we should, like structural practices, aren't going to be appropriate to be applied on 100% of the landscape, but there is room to grow. Likewise, conservation tillage is probably not going to be 100% applied across the landscape. But I think we might want to look at a pretty high goal, if not 100% in the out years, of at least one or the other being on the landscape, one or the other being adopted, so that slice of that pie, could be a challenge goal for us to try to get that to where there's no orange in that slice. May not happen, but at least it's something to shoot for. But that's one of the things we want to use this data for, is to help us kind of set goals for the next 10 years and look at, what do we want this map to look like in CEAP 3. Again, looking at the more thorough treatment, looking at conservation tillage alone. Let me explain some of our definitions here. You can see we have conventional tillage, reduced tillage, and continuous no-till. In our analysis, we actually have 5 classes instead of these 3 classes, and we use for what a lot of people refer to as a rotational tillage. So the conventional tillage includes those that are continuous conventional, as well as those that we call seasonal conventional, and that's where at least one crop in the rotation is conventionally tilled, and another crop in a rotation has some form of conservation tillage, either mulch till, no-till, ridge till, something else. But all those are in the same group of at least some crop in that rotation, if not all of them, are conventionally tilled. Now the no-till one, continuous no-till, that's exactly what it says. Every one of those has a stir less than 20, and all the crops grown in that rotation are under a no-till. And whereas reduced tillage includes those that are always mulch till, and then those that bounce into some no-till and then come back to mulch till. But there's no conventional tillage in that grouping. One of the things we did see in this survey was there was a reduction in those that do rotational tillage. So we had a shift from the seasonal conventional tillage group and to getting rid of conventional tillage and moving towards conservation tillage. We had no growth there, and we had a decline in conventional tillage overall. The same with the seasonal no-till. They either went to staying all the way mulch till all the time, or they went all the way into continuous no-till. So they're not bouncing around as much as they used to with that rotational tillage. They're finding their tillage regimes that they're comfortable with and kind of staying in that lane. I know from CEAP 1, I thought we had a significant amount of conservation tillage out there, and I kind of thought that that technology has been around a while, so we were approaching saturation, but I was definitely wrong about that, because you can see reduced till and continuous no-till increased by 60 million acres, and the continuous no-till, you can see that was an increase of 74%, being just right at 60 million acres to now over 100 million acres are in continuous no-till. So that is a huge shift right there that was totally unexpected for us. Another big shift in conservation tillage for reduced tillage, and then we've got that big decline in conventional tillage as well. But to me, that's one of the biggest news stories. Not only the combination of structural with conservation tillage, but these huge shifts towards conservation tillage, and it's huge such that conventional tillage is now no longer conventional. In CEAP 1, half the acres had conventional tillage on it. at one point in time, if not permanently. And now it's down to 32%. 68% of the acres are now under some form of conservation tillage, with the no-till going from 20% of the acres to 33% of the acres, continuous no-till. So here again, we saw the orange piece of the pie is getting smaller, that green piece is getting bigger, and that's what we want. And here's, you know, where do we want that? Where do we want these slices to go in the next 10 years? How much more conventional tillage can we get out of the system and move into some conservation tillage efforts? One of the other things that was kind of unique that we saw, you all are familiar with USDA's symbol that's got the moldboard plow right there in the middle of it, you know, our seal of our department. That implement that probably was used on every single cultivated acre in the U.S., if not the world, it's probably responsible for a lot of food production increases that gave us the Industrial Revolution and those type things. Today is down to 6% of the acres use moldboard plow. So it's almost a non-existent implement that's in our symbol, in our implement. I think that's a good reminder of how far we've come with conservation when you think about implements like that no longer seen on the landscape. So now we're getting to the section where we're looking at these multiple practices being applied, and this was kind of another surprise that we had. You know, the comprehensive planning is starting to pay off, so we're looking at the multiple resource concerns and really layering these structural practices on to kind of follow that avoid, control, trap recipe. So these are kind of mostly your control and trap type activities that we're finding there. And so we found more structures on 35.5 million acres. 25 million of them were with multiple practices, and by CEAP 2, 48% of all acres were treated with one or more structural practices. So that's a lot of the acres, because we only have about, I think, 90 million HEL acres, and so that nearly 150 million is a big chunk of NHEL get treated. And that's another thing we want to always remember. Just because that's not doesn't mean NHEL doesn't mean that they don't erode. They're just not as highly erodible as the others. So they need some treatment on there. And in many places, we're not going to reach any water quality goals unless we do kind of over apply practices, if you will. But at least move away from more T-based planning and thinking about going further than that and reducing sediment losses and the associated nutrient losses by treating these NHEL acres. And you can see that did occur in these bar charts between CEAP 1 and CEAP 2, the NHEL. Saw a huge increase in acres getting treated to well over 100 million. And the big increase in the green bar shows that they used more than one structural practice. So even the NHEL are getting multiple structural practices applied to them to help reduce the runoff losses from these fields. Over on the HEL side, again, there's not as many acres of those over there, and you can see that the use of one structural practices on HEL land didn't change a lot. So those little blue bars are almost the same height in the two surveys, but the multiple practices on HEL had a significant increase between those two time periods. And that's just really showing a good recognition through our planning process of putting multiple things out there to get that landscape control to meet T regulations and maybe go beyond that. So those are big, real significant changes, and a real point towards our voluntary approach is working, because we're not just getting them to meet the minimum, we're getting to go beyond that. And they're adding more and more practices out there. Looking at our most vulnerable acres, this kind of gets at that targeting topic. We need to be targeting all of our practices out there. But we're just going to look at what happened on the HEL acres with this slide. You can see that the HEL acres that had nothing on them went from a little over 20 million down to a little over 10 million that had none. That's a 39% decrease. With structural practices only, that decreased 34%. And then you can see with conventional tillage only addressing these HEL acres, that increased a good bit. But the biggest increase came with structural plus conservation tillage, which I've alluded to several times, with that 71% increase. That's about 15 million more acres took that increase there. So that's really good news. It does show that we're targeting. the worst soils on our landscape that are causing some problems. And that's exactly what, we were challenged to do over the last 10 plus years, and these numbers are showing that we're being successful at that. Again, here's our graphical representation of that, and you can see the shift from CEAP 1 to CEAP 2. You can see how those orange sections are getting smaller. We went from 27% of the landscape not having any of the HEL lands, not having any practices, down to only 15% not having anything. Again, those were at that wind erosion area, and that's where we're getting into a lot of our, we don't have a very big toolbox controlling wind erosion, and a lot of that toolbox are vegetative practices that are requiring the landowner to spend a little water to get those things to grow. And so when you're in, water deficit areas where water resources are scarce, you've got a trade-off of resource concerns there. So we really need to start thinking about what other things can we do there. I think the Freedom to Farm Act in the 90s that allowed crop rotations on some of these commodity crops like cotton, that you were kind of penalized if you rotated a high residue crop in there with it. Those type things are helping control erosion on these HEL lands, and that's not covered in this section of the slide. So cropping system changes that may help with addressing HEL isn't on this slide, but it's still, we've got some work to do, and we maybe even need some technical advancements or some out-of-the-box thinking to start looking at that wind erosion slice. But even with that, you can see the Southern Plains, where our biggest issues are, went from 48% down to 29%. So there was a big hump drop down there with no practices on it. So that was a tremendous amount of work by the folks in those states. Same thing in the Northwest, that went from 50%, 51% down to 30%. So even the areas that had some of the bigger challenges, we still saw some declines in adoption in practices, even with the issues around water and basically the lack of a very big toolbox as compared to the one we have to control water erosion being out there. So there is progress made there. This is another one that we need to set goals with. What do we want these pies to look like in the next 10 years? And then see how we can go about doing that. Again, another way to look at this, we developed this soil vulnerability index as an analytical tool with CEAP, and it's become fairly handy in doing conservation planning. Many of you that have looked at soil surveys and understand the soils, you can have as many as 300 map units within one county. And for someone, to ask someone to rapidly, do some planning with that and have to, have some knowledge about each one of those map units is a bit of a challenge. So we broke it down into basically 4 groups for runoff and 4 groups for leaching, and this is for runoff for these practices. And so you can almost, color code them, and if they're in high and they light up red, immediately I've got a lot of work to cut out in that section. So with that, looking at the SVI ratings of here with the high, moderately high, moderate and low, the percent down there is the breakdown of acres that fit in each of those categories. You can see 56% of the 315 million acres out there are in that low category, and only 11% are in this high category. And you can think of those as the worst of the worst HEL. They're the really the soils that have the most challenges. So in looking at our data, we saw that about 60% of the adoption of the multiple structures, we're real proud of those multiple structures, and 60% of that went on the moderately high and high SVI rating. So 60% of that went on 30% of the soils. So at that 2-to-1 ratio, I'd say that's really good evidence that we've done that targeting that many challenged us to do. And I think that's a really good news story right there. And of those, half of those not only had the multiple practices, but they also had the conservation tillage added to it. So that's another big sign that people are getting real serious about treating these most problematic soils. Again, here's another one about practice adoption, and it goes back to that same breakout where we looked at no practices at all on the high SBI. So this is that 11% that's the most challenging for us to address. And you can see the structural practices and conservation tillage, that's the hot spot. They were putting both those practices out there on these vulnerable lands, and that increased by 89% between the 2 surveys. So that's a really good testament to our folks understanding the landscape, and then working with the landowner to get the maximum amount of conservation on the land to do the maximum amount of protection we can on those. So kind of to wrap this up a little bit, I got a few slides after this, but to kind of get close to wrapping this up, in that decade of progress, we saw conservation tillage as a whole increase by 39%, and that's going from 153 million acres to 213 million acres. Well, that's just a phenomenal increase that I would have never guessed. Had we gone through the goal-setting exercise for these different practices 10 years ago, half of that would have been a stretch in my mind, thinking that we were already saturated with that practice, but the landowner adoption really surprised us on that. Structural practices, again, these aren't cheap things to put out there. We saw a huge increase in those with a 30% increase, but almost 40 million acre increase in that as well. And then this multiple layering of practices, to me, that's the biggest great story, where you've got conservation tillage and structural practices going in together, really, rounding out that avoid, control, trap approach to controlling erosion, going from 63 million to over almost 109 million is a phenomenal increase in change in that. But we may not have all, that's a lot of really, really good news. We do see, we show that the structural practices, is room for growth. And one of the things I looked at is looking at the riparian zone. And that's kind of, definitely what they say, the rubber meets the road, because that's the last line of defense before anything leaving the landscape gets into the water. And so those are really critical areas for us to address. So what we did here was to look at the NRI points, not the fields, but the points themselves that were within 200 feet. See, the field could be even further away, or even right up next to the water's edge in this case. We picked 200 feet because that's one of the common setbacks for pesticide application. So I figured that was a good number to pick from. And so from the sample set that we found, we saw that we had an increase in acres from 12% of the acres, of those acres that fit that within 200 feet. 12% of them had an edge of field practice, like a filter strip, a buffer strip, in the riparian area, or even a field border, anything in there. Only 12% had it. We increased that to 25%, but that's pretty small to be that that major practice that does the most for water quality and capturing all the runoff from the surfaces. So this is something. This is not a complete analysis. You could have an NRI point that's a little bit further away, but the actual field might be right up to the stream's edge. So it's something I think we really need to maybe do a little more aggressive formal assessment of how much the problem is, because as you move east, riparian areas just happen. They don't have to be right out of our technical guides and been placed in there by NRCS. Now you can argue how effective they are as compared to one that we've done a little engineering and strategic planting with and those type of things, but they're at least still there and having some function. So we need to have some type of an assessment of what the real need is to put some stream bank protection up here, and to try to do as much as we can to keep it from getting into the water from these fields that are close to the stream. So a little more work there, but definitely the analysis that we have there is that this is an area which I think we can improve in quite a bit, and make that orange piece of the pie there on the structural practice adoption. The other thing I alluded to several times was the progress on wind erosion. And this is a table for wind erosion on highly erodible lands. See, I've got circled in red. So the use of structural practices only pretty stagnant, 2% in both of them. Now we did see significant declines in those that had nothing. We went from 55% of the HEL acres that are HEL because of wind erosion down to 32%. But there's still 32% out there, and these are those HEL acres. Most of that progress was made through the adoption of conservation tillage. It went from 40% of those acres to 62%. And then that, that layering, since we aren't adopting a lot more structural practices out there, that didn't change much. That went from 2 to 4%. That is percent-wise, that's a 100% increase, but that really doesn't mean anything when you're that small. So there's a gap there. We need to look at this. We need to see how many of these are being protected a little bit by things like unique crop rotation, maybe the timing of their tillage. They may not be in conservation tillage, but their tillage timing may be more tillage during times of the year when wind erosion is less likely. So there may be strategies that are going on out there that aren't captured, but I think we still need to do a little better job on figuring out what to do with these from the structural sense, or do a little better job of finding out what these landowners are doing if they're not adding these structural practices, and how much of a problem that truly is. In our results, when we get to putting out results, these are just input reports. But when our output reports come, we'll be able to take a little closer look at it, see if that tillage timing and other factors are helping reduce wind erosion or not. So getting to the last slide, kind of what's next with the CEAP cropland work. We've got a series of input reports. One thing we learned from CEAP 1 is that we had these, each river basin was a 250 to 300 page report that quite frankly didn't get read, even though those of us that were working on them had a lot of trouble reading through all of it. So that's just too much to consume, and so there was some valuable information that kind of got lost by having it all in one place and in one report. So we're splitting these up and kind of making them topical on the input side. And then once the input reports are out there and you kind of have a feel of that, we'll be able to refer back to those reports when we talk about their impact on edge of field losses. So those reports will come off next. So we've got crop rotations and cover crop, irrigation, nutrient management, and pest management. There'll be some other reports that are out there along with those, but these are the primary ones that'll be going out. And then with the outcomes, we'll look at the change, what's lost at the edge of the field, what's the change in sediment, nutrients, pesticides. All that's going to look at those changes at the edge of the field. And in doing that, we'll start getting a picture of, okay, what's left to do? What are the treatment needs that are out there? And get that assessment. And with those treatment needs, we're able, with the modeling system that we have, is to do multiple different treatment scenarios, not just have one conservation planning thought. We can do lots of different treatments, include cover crops, don't include them, include cover crops and tillage versus conservation tillage adoption, and do lots of little games like that with those to look at that, and then go through an optimization process, and through that we'll know what practices could be adopted, and we'll have an idea not only what needs to be treated at a Huck 4 scale, but about what it's going to cost. And I think that will help folks at headquarters with funding decisions possibly, and any other priority needs or goal setting. And there's lots of things that can be done once we have that bits of information to them. So that's all I've got with that. I think this is where we go to any questions. I think Leah's kind of booked up some questions, and we'll offer those out to us next.
Yep, thank you, Lee. So we have some questions and some comments that you may want to make additional comments on. I'll start with some of the clarifying questions. Two participants asked, could you offer examples of some of the most popular structural practices, and could you share a list of the structural practices included in the CEAP 2?
Okay, now we have about 38 total practices in there, and I think I don't want to put too much on which practices are most commonly adopted, because the planning process should dictate that. And but in general, we do see an increase in field borders was probably the biggest increase that we saw. Their efficacy can be depending on where they end up. But after that, were probably filter strips increased a significant amount. Grass waterways was another one that saw a pretty decent jump. And those, in the report that's going to come out, all the changes in those individual practices will be part of that report that will be coming out. Let's see. But the big jumps were obviously in conservation tillage. A lot of the practices that are out there, of those 38, they're the our most common suspects that are out there. Terraces, hillside ditches, grass waterways, any of the water control structures. See what else? Crosswind trap strips, hedgerows, shelter belts. Like I said, there's a list there, and that also will be in that report. So it's a fairly extensive list that we have in there.
Okay, thank you. There are also a couple of questions about how the survey was administered or what input assumptions you used. So one of them was, how were the percent slopes and length of slope determined? Were the slopes determined or actually verified in the field at the point? Or were the slopes and length of slopes based upon default values for the soil map unit?
They were the, okay,
sorry,
I'll go ahead and take that one.
Okay, take that one first.
Okay, because it's right on my mind, because this is really key, and it points out the value of the work that was put in by our agency at these NRI points. Or someone was actually sent out there, a soil scientist was actually sent out there, and oftentimes accompanied by agronomists back in the 70s and 80s. And every single point had the soil verified and then had the slope length determined for that soil point. So those were on-site verifications using the NRI that we use there.
Okay, and following up on that, is the no-till based upon what the farmer told the person who was conducting the interview, or is that field verified?
It's not field verified, but it's verified through what the farmers told us they did. So a lot of times the farmers will tell us that they did one type of tillage, and we'll look at them, then they'll list their implements. So they'll list what implements they used, when they used them, how often they used them, and those type things. And then we use the STIR values of those implements, as well as residue estimates that we get from the model to determine if they made it no-till or not, or made it to conservation tillage. So, obviously field verification is very difficult because you could be there one day and it changes the next. But by them in that one-to-one face-to-face interview, what's really unique about this interview is that it's not conducted by a professional agronomist or professional conservationist of any kind. So there's no leading of the witness, if you will. And NASS has found that they get more truthful answers, more candid answers, I guess should be the right word, by using these enumerators, which actually come from the community. So they're actually talking to someone from their community, and that's where that raw data comes from. And so we base our tillage type on what implements they use. We do ask them what they did, and what's interesting is that conventional tillage is still one of the most common answers, but they're comparing themselves to someone that's continuously no-till. So if you're in a conservation tillage and you're tilling, in your mind, you're tilling a whole lot more than your neighbor that's doing no-till at all, you might call yourself conventional, but they end up being conservation tillage. So we found that about 75% of those that self-identified themselves as conventional tillage actually weren't. They actually were some form of mulch till.
Okay. And this question is a clarification question that is worth following up on because people have the slides and have downloaded them. What does the size of the pie charts on the national maps mean?
Well, some of them is supposed to reflect acreage, but I did just notice that some of them got a little too big on one of them than the other. So we'll have to resize those to make sure, because some of them were built at different times. So before the final production, but the bigger the pie is the larger number of acres in that production region. So our Corn Belt, that big production region, that's the north central Midwest region that we have, that's got well over 150 million acres in it, and so it's got that great big pie out there. So those sizes should relate between each other, but within a graphic, those sizes relate to the acreage, total acreage in that region.
Okay, thank you. So one question is, how can ephemeral gully erosion be included in the reported conservation effects on highly erodible lands?
As soon as someone comes up with an ephemeral gully erosion model.
Okay.
Oftentimes, one of the things that in our work, we do a calculation of sheet and reel erosion using Russell 2. And many times, and we also do a calculation of sediment delivery. And a lot of times you'll see that the sediment delivery is actually higher than the sheet and reel erosion number. And that kind of tells us that sediment delivery model is picking up some ephemeral gullies. So that's one way that we kind of do it in a backdoor fashion. When we do our modeling and we see somebody applied a grass waterway in there that's going to control some of that gullying, we take that away so we know what's there. But we really don't know, unless that of its needs there. One thing that often happens is that when you find two soil map units kind of coming together, is oftentimes where you find that. But in many times you'll also notice in no-till, if they're not on the contour really well, they can actually create some channelized erosion and create some ephemeral work there. So on the cases that when we see that we suspect there might be some ephemeral erosion, it's often associated with the systems that have some no-till. And so the no-till may say the Russell 2 may have 1.5 to 2 tons of sheet and reel erosion, and then we'll have 2.5 tons of sediment delivery. So we know something else, some channelizations get occurring by that difference in calculation.
Okay. So we have a few more minutes and a few more questions, so we'll keep going. One participant asks, what percentage of practices were installed with cost share funds?
That is something we don't know, because some of these folks will take a practice and then we've cost shared them on one part of their land, and then they may take that practice to another part of the landscape on their own. Or a neighbor sees it, likes it, asks, how'd you do that? What do you got to do that? And then they go and do it on theirs. So even though we do ask them, we don't even ask them about percent cost share. We do have a question in the survey about did you get cost share or not, but we don't ask them how much. Because these points are expanded, statistically expanded, that each of those individual cases, you could have neighbors that apply the same practice, but and would be covered under that expansion factor for that point, but one of them had a different cost share agreement than the other because of whatever reason.
Okay, and also related to program participation, do your reports and surveys just account for conservation practices planned and implemented through the Farm Bill programs, or does it seek to include state, other federal program, NGOs, and landowner-funded conservation practices?
It captures them all. It captures the whole thing, from 100% cost share down to the landowner did it themselves, federal, non-federal, significant amount. Conservation tillage and nutrient management are two of them that you'll find that they're adopting and utilizing, and we have no record in our books on it. And there's a huge disparity. And I guess many of you know that when you've got a lot of conservation tillage, you hadn't cost shared on a lot of it. In fact, that's a vast minority on those. So we capture everything they're doing out there, regardless of the source. We do try to capture an idea of how much they're getting help on different practices or their overall practice efforts, but we don't know the specifics of those.
Okay, and did your survey include any estimates of increases in drainage management?
Yes, we do have some of that in there. I can't remember the numbers on drainage water management that came in there, so that is not there. One of the things about drainage water management or drainage management, sometimes they're managing the tile and sometimes they're installing tile in some of those practices, but we did not include that in this presentation, but we do have that information gathered from the landowner.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question, and a couple of people asked, do you have a timeline of when your the remaining input reports will be released?
Yes, I do. Now the next question is, do I think I'm going to adhere to the timeline? And I hope so. But where we have these rolling, hopefully out on a fairly regular basis, hopefully on a close to a monthly basis. So the next one that we do have on the books that our writers have will be cover crops and crop rotation. And then that's going to follow up by irrigation unless pest management gets up there. Nutrient management is the most difficult one, and it's probably going to be the last one out, but it's also the one that's got the highest level of interest. We also have these reviewed externally and internally, so depending on what the reviewers find or if there's any major changes needed, typically that doesn't occur, but just in case that may alter the schedule. But overall, we're going to try to have at least an internal reviewed draft of these reports of everything ready by the end of the year. So when the Farm Bill discussions start back up, we're coming to the table as an agency with some information.
Okay, thank you, Lee. We're at the top of the hour, but I'd like to thank Kevin Norton and Lee Norfleet for taking time out of their schedules to provide an excellent presentation on trends in conservation practice adoption. Thanks also to everyone who attended today's webinar. We hope to see you next month for the next installment in the Conservation Outcomes webinar series, which will be called From Counting Acres to Making Acres Count, Quantifying Restoration Outcomes in Frequent Fire Forests. Have a good afternoon, everyone.